Now, as tensions rise after the Boston Massacre and the Stamp Act Congress and all the other uh, tensions between um, the colonists and England rise, uh, the colonists decide that it's probably time to get together, even more so in the way they did with the Stamp Act Congress, and try to resolve these problems. Now, one thing we have to remember as they get into the Continental Congress, that a large majority of them, most, uh, if you want to use statistics, most of the colonists are still loyal British subjects. They're still uh, want to stay part of the British Empire because there's a lot of benefits to that: security, just protection, also economic privileges with being part of the British Empire. But with all the tensions, with the extra taxes, the blockade of Boston Harbor, um, things are getting to be to a breaking point, getting to towards a breaking point. And so the First Continental Congress is convened in Philadelphia in the fall of 1774. And basically what they've decided to do is issue a Declaration of Rights and Resolves. And basically it's a list of the grievances and asking, the king and parliament to address these grievances. And in a nutshell, basically what they're wanting is everything to revert back to like it was before uh, the French and Indian War, before the 7 Years' War, when basically the colonies were able to do whatever they wanted to, and the British just ignored them. But of course, the British are not going to let that happen at this point. So they send this Declaration of Rights and Resolves, asking, for, explaining their side of the story, and they decided that, of course, we don't have email at this point, and there's no telephone, so it's got to get on a boat and cross the Atlantic and then come back, and so there's going to be a delay. And so they adjourn the Congress and they decide that if the demands are not met, they don't hear back in a positive way, they will meet again in May of 1775. But the month before that, when that meeting was due to happen, you have what we now know of as, and we call the shots heard around the world, where you have the first real confrontation, military confrontation between the colonists and the British. While the Boston Massacre was kind of an accident, this was an organized, planned ambush by the colonists of the British redcoats who were trying to go confiscate ammo and gunpowder from an armory in Lexington and Concord. So with this hanging over their head, this Lexington and Concord, the bloodshed, the Second Continental Congress meets, and they make one last attempt to mend the fences with Great Britain by sending something called the Olive Branch Petition, and they're going to have to wait for a reply from that. But in the meantime, they realize that they're getting close to an irrevocable break with Great Britain, and they realize that if that happens, that there will be war. They form a Continental Army. Well, they don't really form it. They just say, okay, we will start forming a Continental Army, and they choose George Washington to head this Continental Army. He's probably the most respected man, one of the most respected men at the Continental Congress, and he's got military experience, and he's willing to take the job. And it's during this debate, a little later after the appointment of Washington, that Richard Henry Lee, a representative from Virginia, stands up and calls for independence and says, we've come this far. The ties between us and the mother country are irrevocably broken. There's nothing that can fix it. We're on the verge of war, so let's go ahead and declare kind of what we already think we are, and that's independent. And so this thus begins a great debate. Many people think that the early colonists, when they were discussing this independence, were everybody jumped on board and said, "Yeah, let's do it." And there was no dissent. There was a lot of dissent. There was a lot of debate because the ramifications of declaring independence and losing were huge. Uh, Basically, if you declare independence, you're declaring war against your country, and that's treason. And the penalty for treason in almost every nation is death. So Uh, they're arguing that, they're saying declare independence, but they really have no army. They just formed the Continental Army, which really has no soldiers, only a bunch of colonial militias. And so, and they're facing the greatest military on earth in the British Empire. So the loss would mean all of their heads. Uh, and so nothing was resolved in the debate, but they did decide to form a committee to work on a possible declaration of independence. If in case that independence was voted on, then they would have something to tell the people, a document for the people. And that committee to work on the declaration that was consisted of Ben Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, and most famously Thomas Jefferson, who is considered the author of the Declaration of Independence. And he did write most of it, but he had some input from the others. Finally, on July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress finally adopts the Declaration of Independence after all their attempts to fix things with Great Britain fail. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Locke is maybe the most influential philosopher in in American history, because his ideas on natural rights, on the role of government in protecting life, liberty, and property, and on the idea that if the government does not properly work for the people, that you have the right to overthrow it. All of these ideas are in the Declaration of Independence, especially the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, which of course was mostly written by Thomas Jefferson. And so I'm going to read it real quick, and we'll go through and we'll try to find these Lockean influences. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Of course, this is maybe the most hypocritical and controversial line in the whole thing, because Jefferson writes all men are created equal. Of course, he's a slave owner. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Remember those natural rights that Locke talked about? That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, Locke said life, liberty, and property, but for whatever reason they switched property to happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, social contract. The people decide. Only the people can agree to be governed. Only the people can consent to have rules made that affect them. And so they are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, meaning that when any form of government stops protecting life, liberty, and happiness, and stops considering the consent of the governed, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Of course, that's Locke's idea. Hobbes would say no, but Locke says yes, you can alter or abolish it. And to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So as you can see, he's basically spelling out, the rights of man, and their rights in forming their own government, and how and the basic underlying principle is that all governments must come from the consent of the governed. No longer will we accept kings who say, "I am your king because I am." You, the people, have to consent for him to be the king and agree for him to be the king. And so the Declaration of Independence has been ratified, and now, therefore, the colonies are now states, and they are free and independent, separate from Great Britain. But there's a problem. Now they have to form their own national government. And basically the government, they know they have to form a government simply for the fact that they're going to fight a war. And you must have centralized authority in war. You can't have 13 different states fighting 13 different wars without some kind of overarching central authority. So they formed their first national government, and it's the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation is the first American government. For testing purposes, it's the first American government. And they themselves called it a loose league of friendship. And it's a confederation form of government, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about federalism. But basically, in a confederation form of government, the states have all the power. The states or regional governments are sovereign, meaning there's no other authority higher than them. And in a confederation form of government, these sovereign states form the national government. They create the national government and give the national government any power that they want it to have. And because they formed the national government and the states gave the national government the power that it has, they can strip that power. They can alter the national government whenever and if ever they want to. So all the power in a confederation form of government lies with the states. Now, the main points of the Articles of Confederation are this: there will be a single legislative body that basically has very little power and is only allowed basically wartime powers, because that's why they formed the government in the first place, is to fight the Revolutionary War. Uh, each state retains its sovereignty and independence with absolute authority within its territories, meaning that the national government cannot tell the states anything, that they make them do anything they don't want to do. One vote per state in the Congress, regardless of state size. This will be a sticking point because Virginia will resent the fact that Rhode Island has equal status in the Articles of Confederation Congress, even though Rhode Island is much smaller, has a much smaller economy, and many fewer people. If you want to pass any law in the Articles of Confederation Congress, it takes 9 of 13 states. And that's so difficult because, as we mentioned earlier, the states are just, at this point, those states, the southern states, are so different and have different interests than the New England states. It's going to be very hard for them to agree on anything. And if you want to amend the articles, meaning actually change the Articles of Confederation, it takes the unanimous vote of all the states. And if you can't pass a law of 9 of 13, there's no way you're going to get a unanimous vote for anything. And selection and payment of delegates is by the respective states, meaning if the states lose interest in the Confederation and they lose interest in the Congress, then they'll quit paying their representatives and their representatives will quit going. While the Articles of Confederation worked relatively well during the Revolutionary War, it served its purpose. It kept the states kind of focused on the goal. Once the war was over, uh, the national government floundered. The states really didn't see it as necessary anymore. Remember, initially it was just a loose league of friendship for the purpose of fighting the war. Now that the war is over and they're independent, the states are kind of all going their own way, and it creates major problems. And historians have later called this the critical period. The period of 1781, which is basically the end of the Revolutionary War, through 1789, which is the establishment of the U.S. Constitution. Here are the problems that existed. First, lack of national sentiment. Lack of national sentiment. People were loyal to their states and not to the national government. People like Jefferson always said, I can't wait to go back to my country, Virginia. And so, that was very common, where people identified more with their states and were more loyal to their states than to the nation. The Articles of Confederation Congress had no power to tax. They could ask for money, but they couldn't force states or anybody to pay the money. So it was all voluntary from the states. And that might not be such a problem, except that the national government during the Revolutionary War borrowed money from other nations to fight the war. And without the ability to tax, they did not have the ability to pay back their debt. And as a new country on the scene, on the world stage, that's not a good way to start off, by not paying back your debts. They had no power to regulate commerce, meaning no power to regulate trade between the states. So if there were any trade disputes between, say, Pennsylvania and New York, there was nobody to settle it. There was nobody to be an arbiter. So it could often possibly end up in, as most territorial disputes could end up in war. and there was no power of Congress, of the legislature, of the Articles of Confederation to regulate that. There was no executive or judicial branch, meaning the Articles of Confederation Congress could make a law, but there was no executive branch to carry out the law or enforce the law. There's no judicial branch to place people on trial if they broke the law. So it was a very weak government, and there was just a general lack of a strong central governing authority. The central government, the Articles of Confederation, national government, basically had no power to do anything. And everybody kind of knew it, but nobody really wanted to do anything about it until one event happened. And that one event was called Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion kind of lit a fire under the elites, especially the elites of the states. And here's basically what happened with Shays' Rebellion. The state of Massachusetts had its own debt from the Revolution. They borrowed money themselves as well to fund the war for their state, to pay their militia. And they created debt. And so Massachusetts passes a new constitution that basically places the burden, the taxation burden, on farmers. And those are the poorest people. They're poor and middle class. They're the farmers. Of course, the elites are making the Constitution, and they're the very wealthy, and they're the ones living in Boston and in the city, and they're not. The Constitution benefits them and really punishes the farmers. Well, this angers the farmers. Also, they began foreclosing on farms of Revolutionary War veterans. Now, you got to remember, most everybody's a farmer back then. And when people came calling, when the American government came calling, or the states came calling, asking people to fight in the Revolutionary War, well, that means those people, those men, would have to leave their farms. And while, the wives and the children and possibly slaves here and there would be able to run the farm, that's still one less hand to work when the patriarch has gone to fight a war. And also, usually the patriarch, handles the financial business during that time. So basically, there was an understood agreement between the governments and these Revolutionary War veterans that when they asked them to go fight in the Revolutionary War, they wouldn't punish them if they got behind on their payments. But Massachusetts began to foreclose, and this greatly angered the farmers. And one of those farmers was a Revolutionary War veteran named Daniel Shays, who organized, and he wasn't a great military leader. He was something like a sergeant or something, which means he was a decent soldier, but nothing spectacular. So Shays is angry, and he rallies a bunch of other farmers and a bunch of other people who are being suppressed or oppressed by this new constitution, and they march on Springfield, Massachusetts, which is the capital of Massachusetts, and they basically shut down the government. They shut down all the judicial proceedings and the foreclosure proceedings. They shut down the government and demand a change in the taxation burden and and demand the stopping of the foreclosing on farms. And you've got the Massachusetts legislature who doesn't know what to do, and so they would call out a militia to stop them, but most of the militia is in Shays' Rebellion, and so they send word to the national government, come help us. We've got this insurrection on our hands, and of course the Articles of Confederation Congress is going to say what? Well, you don't pay taxes, you don't give us any power to establish an army, we can't help you at all, you're on your own. So Massachusetts had to hire a private militia to put down this rebellion. Of course, there wasn't much bloodshed. Once the militia was formed to put it down, everything kind of scattered. But it did strike fear into the elites of all the states, not just Massachusetts, because and it made them understood the need for a stronger national government. And here's why. Many of these elites, they're all very wealthy people, and the greatest fear of wealthy people is to lose their wealth. And an even greater fear of wealthy people is to lose their wealth to the poor, that the poor, take it away from them, that they overwhelm them and take it away. And what they saw with Shays' Rebellion is they saw a mediocre, if not, bad military leader organize a militia and completely take over a state with just maybe 12, 1500 um, farmers with muskets and pitchforks, and they took over and shut down an entire state. And the great fear was, and they said to themselves, well, what would happen if instead of being Daniel Shays, it was some charismatic, brilliant military leader, and instead of 1200 to 1500 soldiers, it was 10 or 20 or 30,000. If that happened, there's no way they could stop them. They could take over every single state in the nation, and there's no strong central authority to stop them. So basically, it was that Shays Rebellion that put fear into the elites of the states, and would force and will force them to change the national government to one that is much more powerful and has the ability to actually govern.